Our fourth mechanism of evolutionary change is the process of natural selection. Now, this is the big one. This is the one that Charles Darwin was talking about. This is the one that provided a explanation for the process of evolution. It's the way that descent with modification works. So I sort of think of natural selection and descent with modification as very, very similar. Natural selection is sort of the way that descent with modification happens. It's the way that evolution happens. So there are three things that are required for natural selection to occur. One is that there has to be variation for a particular trait in a population. That variation must be heritable. So in other words, it must be passed on to the next generation. And if natural selection is going to happen, one of the versions of that trait has to allow the individual to produce more offspring than those that have a different version. In other words, those individuals with one specific trait have differential reproductive success. One trait allows them to leave more offspring than another. So let's talk about this first one, condition 1, variation for a trait. Now this particular one means that in general, there's a lot of variation within a population. But more specifically, it means that there's variation for the specific trait that evolution is working on. Now in a few minutes, or actually in the next video, we're going to talk about how we actually can quantify evolution. And when we do that, we look at one specific allele frequency. We look at how one allele changes over time, because that's our smallest definition of evolution, is the change in allele frequency. So when we say variation for a trait, we mean one specific trait has more than one allele. It might be 2 alleles, it might be 3 alleles, different versions. But if we look for variation, we can see variation all over the place. The example that our book gives are the differences in domesticated dogs. They're all one species, but they all vary greatly in their traits. Some to the extreme. Over here we've got a Great Dane and possibly a Chihuahua. I'm not entirely sure what that maybe not a Chihuahua, little dog. I don't know what that one is. But evolution can only work if there is pre-existing variation for a trait. Now this is another one of the misconceptions that I often see on a test or on an assignment. And that is that evolution can create new variation. Evolution does not create anything. Evolution changes what is already there. So variation can come from mutation, variation can come from new combinations of alleles, but evolution does not make a new version, a new allele. And evolution cannot happen if there is no variation. So in the last video, I talked about cheetahs that had gone through a bottleneck event about 10,000 years ago, and they're all essentially genetically identical. That means that the cheetah population cannot evolve unless a mutation arises within one of those individuals that provides an advantage. That population cannot evolve because they are already genetically identical. And without variation, no particular trait can survive better than any others. And we'll talk about that one in a minute. So condition number 2 is that the trait that you are looking at must be heritable. So we've already talked about genetic inheritance and the idea that individuals pass on information to the next generation, and that information is encoded in their gametes. But sometimes variation is actually variation that is due to the environment. So the variation that you're talking about must be genetically controlled, not something that is variation due to an environmental factor. For example, there are some types of praying mantis that change color or change their features throughout their lifetime based on the particular plant that they are living on and eating. So chemicals from the plant and whatnot can actually change their color. Now that is not necessarily inherited, because if the individual moves to another plant, changes its food source, and has babies there, that individual and its babies are going to look different simply because of the environment. So keep in mind, when we say the trait has to be heritable, you can only inherit the actual information for that trait, because otherwise you are evolving individuals, and we said that individuals do not evolve, and you're sort of going down the path that Lamarck went down, which was the idea of individuals acquiring characteristics over their lifetime. All right, so finally, third condition for natural selection is that there has to be differential reproductive success. Now, some of this goes back to Darwin and the influence that Thomas Malthus had on him, and that is that to start off with, there are more organisms born than can survive, which means that some of them are going to struggle to survive, and therefore some of them are more likely to survive than others. So differential reproductive success says that some individuals are more likely to survive because of specific traits. And this is really where we get to the heart of natural selection, that some individuals are born with genetic characteristics that make them better able to survive and reproduce. And when that happens, you're more likely to pass on those beneficial traits to the next generation than another individual that doesn't have those traits. And so the relative number of those beneficial traits and beneficial alleles is going to increase within the population. So the example that our book uses is this poor little tiny pig who is born small and cannot compete with its siblings to get in to get food. And so that guy is not going to survive as well as the others. And so he's not going to pass on his genes. So if this poor little pig just happened to be born with the small gene that makes him smaller and less robust than the others, he's not going to survive. He's not going to pass on that gene because the other individuals have the genes that allow them to be bigger and stronger. So as a quick summary, natural selection requires variation for a trait. So here we go back to the specific chromosomes and the different alleles encoded on that chromosome. So this diagram is suggesting that this population has 5 different versions of the allele in question. The second condition is that it has to be heritable. So individuals have to be able to pass on that allele. Now, if it's encoded in the chromosomes, that's no problem. It'll get passed on when that parent has offspring. The third one is the one that I think is most important for natural selection, and that is differential reproductive success. So individuals that are better suited for their environment are going to leave more offspring than other versions of the trait. So this here is showing that the blue individuals are going to leave the most offspring, the green colors are going to leave a little bit less, the yellow even less, and the purple even less. So these yellow and purple are the ones that are surviving the least, and their frequencies, if you look from, let's say this was the original population and they're all equal, over time you have fewer purple and more of the others. So this population has changed. Now this is not indicating a particular population, it's just showing the 3 variations. But if we think about it as a population, we can see how those traits have changed over time. Now natural selection is probably the, of the 4 mechanisms, the one that is most often going to cause evolution to happen in a population. And that's because the environment is constantly changing. The stressors that organisms are facing are constantly changing. And so in any given scenario, there are going to be some individuals who already have traits that are better suited for the environment. So here's an example of evolution to sort of show the change in populations and differential survival of individuals. So there was a study done in the 70s in the Galapagos Islands, because everybody likes to study evolution in the Galapagos Islands. And in 1977, there was a severe drought. So during this year, only 180 out of 1,200 birds survived, and it was related to the availability of food for these ground finches. So in wet years, there are more often small, soft shells. Plants produce smaller, softer seeds because there's a lot of moisture available. They can grow quickly. In dry years, though, the seeds have to be more robust. If they are small and soft, they're going to dry out. The seeds are going to die, and no plant will be able to be established. So in dry years, there are usually larger, harder seeds. So before the severe drought in 1977, this graph on the left, the bar on the left of the graph on the right shows that in 1976, the average beak depth was about 9 millimeters. So that's the beak size, which suggests that those birds were eating smaller seeds. So they have a smaller beak size. They're more suited to eating the small, soft seeds. Then the drought came through in 1977, removed the small, soft seeds from the environment. So that removed the food source for those birds that could eat the smaller seeds. In 1978, when they measured beak sizes of these finches, they found that they had increased by about 1.5 millimeters. So they had gotten a bit bigger. Now that might not seem like too much, but if you're a really small bird, that's probably significant. So because of the change in food source, because of this drought and this environmental pressure that took away the small, soft seeds, only the birds with larger, stronger beaks were able to survive. And so then you see that the next generation of birds after 1977 showed an increase in average beak size. So the frequency of the allele that causes the increase in, or causes a larger beak size went up in the population, whereas the smaller beak size went down in the population. So there's a very specific type of natural selection called sexual selection, and this is where individuals select their mates based on particular traits in the opposite sex. So here you can very quickly see differential reproductive success. If individuals have a particular trait that's going to attract a mate, they're going to be more likely to pass on their offspring, and therefore those alleles. So these traits that are being selected in a mate are going to increase in the population because they are one of several variations. Some individuals are going to, say, have smaller antlers while others have larger antlers, or smaller, less colorful feathers while others have larger, more colorful feathers. And as long as they are heritable, they'll pass those alleles on to the next generation. And then very clearly they are showing differential reproductive selection differential reproductive success because they are being selected for based on those traits. So this sexual selection is probably one of the most common characteristics that students are able to identify, and they come from the differences in the sexes of different organisms. So male lions have this big, huge mane, and lionesses will choose males that have that big mane because the ability of that lion to grow this big, huge mane means that he's probably got a lot of resources. He's probably strong. He's probably a good hunter. He's probably a good fighter. He can acquire food for the rest of his pride, and that makes him attractive to those females. Birds very often are a good example of sexual selection. In a lot of bird species, the females are kind of the boring drab colors. You can see this peacock down in the corner, that's the female, and the male with this big, huge tail feathers, bird of paradise that does this sort of crazy dance and flashes its big feathers all over the place, all in an attempt to attract a mate. And then of course we've got large antlers, large horns, things like that. Those are often or very often sexually selected traits. Now there's a trade-off here. If your antlers get too big or your tail feathers get too big, they become too energetically draining. It's too hard to maintain them. You divert too much energy to producing them. So there is a limit to some of these things. And if they get too extreme, they can actually hinder your reproductive success because you have no energy. If you're carrying around a massive rack of antlers that's way too big for your body, you're not going to be able to find a mate and actually mate with her very easily. But these traits persist and increase because they are being selected for by potential mates. So natural selection tends to work as a reduction or elimination process. So there will be variation for a trait. Some individuals will be more successful at reproduction because of that trait. So if we're looking at this rabbit speed here, so some rabbits are fast, some are slower, some are kind of not slow at all, and they pass on this ability to run fast to their offspring. So we've got variation, we've got heritability, and then we introduce a predator. So once that predator comes about, if he is able to catch up with these slowest individuals, their slow allele is going to be reduced from the population. Those individuals that can run away much more quickly are going to continue to pass on that faster gene because they are not being removed from that population. So natural selection will very often reduce those traits that confer poor reproductive success. May not always completely eliminate them because remember, we've got those recessive alleles that can hide out in the population, but they can reduce it to a point where very few individuals actually have it. And then there's always the potential that genetic drift is going to remove that allele from the population.